At 2:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the Arabian Sea, the captain of a 275-meter commercial cargo vessel looked at the radar screen and made a choice. He was staring down the barrel of an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, a billion-dollar apex predator of the United States Navy. The warship held the line. The massive cargo ship did not turn around. To the untrained eye, this looks like madness. A behemoth, displacing nearly as much tonnage as an aircraft carrier and stacked 7 containers high, attempting to sail straight through a strictly enforced American naval blockade. It is a mathematical suicide mission. But this was not a military miscalculation. This was a deliberate, cold-blooded trap. The vessel in the crosshairs was the MV Tusca. The decision her captain made was not about delivering cargo. It was about testing the psychological threshold of an empire. Tehran was forcing the United States into a strategic cage, daring Washington to pull the trigger on a civilian target and ignite a global shockwave. The illusion was that America would hesitate. The brutal reality was about to tear through solid steel. If you want to understand the hidden machinery of global conflict, subscribe to Dr. Arthur Sterling now. We dissect the brutal geopolitical realities that others completely miss. To comprehend the gravity of the standoff in the Arabian Sea, you must first understand the geometry of the vessels involved and the agonizing ticking of a 6-hour clock. The MV Tusca was not a fast attack craft or a stealth frigate. She was an industrial leviathan. At 275 meters long, she displaced a tonnage rivaling a supercarrier, her deck stacked 7 containers high. She was a floating skyscraper moving at 17 knots. Opposing her was the USS Spruance. She is over 500 feet of highly classified, lethal architecture. Displacing 9,000 tons and carrying a crew of 329, the Spruance is armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles, ballistic interceptors, and a 5-inch Mk-45 naval gun. In a conventional naval engagement, the Spruance is an absolute nightmare. But this was not a conventional engagement. This was a masterclass in gray zone warfare. The United States had initiated a total maritime interdiction operation. Every vessel approaching Iranian waters was being turned around. 25 commercial ships had already encountered the blockade perimeter, assessed the lethal reality of American naval power, and altered course. The Tusca, however, belonged to the Mossacar Daria Shipping Company, an entity choked by United States Treasury sanctions for over a decade. Her trajectory was a direct line to Bandar Abbas, Iran's critical maritime artery. When the Spruance detected her on radar at 1400 hours local time, the American warship initiated standard procedures. The initial radio transmissions were sterile, professional, and clear. The Tusca responded with silence. For 6 grueling hours, the American destroyer paced the Iranian cargo ship. This is where the illusion of the civilian shield took hold. The captain of the Tusca was operating under a highly specific, highly dangerous assumption that Washington's political calculus would prevent them from unleashing kinetic force against a commercial vessel. Sinking a ship of that magnitude in international waters would not just trigger a diplomatic firestorm, it would precipitate a catastrophic environmental disaster. The physical mass of the Tusca was meant to be its armor. The Iranian strategy was to paralyze the American blockade with the sheer, cumbersome reality of civilian logistics. They believed they had placed the United States Navy in an impossible position. Intercepting radio chatter across emergency, commercial, and military frequencies, the Spruance logged every warning. They were building an airtight legal ledger. They were giving the Tusca every off-ramp. But as the sun began to set over the Arabian Sea, the physical gap to the Strait of Hormuz was rapidly closing. The American patience was not infinite, it was simply methodical. The illusion of the civilian shield was about to violently collide with the cold mechanics of American enforcement. At the 6-hour mark, the tone on the radio shifted from a warning to a directive. The crew of the Tusca was instructed to vacate their engine room. The United States Navy had exhausted its diplomatic playbook. They were now transitioning to the language of disabling fire. At precisely 2022 hours local time, the agonizing geometry of the standoff collapsed into raw kinetics. The USS Spruance did not request further dialogue, nor did it refer the matter to a committee in Washington. Its forward-mounted 5-inch Mk-45 naval gun locked onto the structural heart of the MV Tusca, the engine room. The mathematics of a firing solution are absolute. Range, trajectory, wind speed, and sea state converge into a singular, irreversible vector. When a 70-pound shell leaves the barrel of an Mk-45, it travels at over 2,600 feet per second. It does not warn, it obliterates. The Spruance unleashed 3 consecutive rounds. This is where the American tactical playbook separates itself from brute force. The objective was not destruction. Sinking a 275-meter vessel in international waters creates an uncontrollable environmental crisis and an unmanageable diplomatic fallout. The objective was kinetic surgery, strategic paralysis. The first round punched through the steel hull plating as if it were paper, striking the engine room dead center. The subsequent shells ruptured fuel lines, shattered coolant systems, and entirely dismantled the main propulsion machinery. In a matter of seconds, an industrial behemoth that had been churning at 17 knots was reduced to a dead, drifting mass of iron. The civilian shield was physically neutralized, but kinetic force only stops a vessel. It does not secure the geopolitical asset. 15 kilometers to the north, the USS Tripoli had been holding station. Displacing 41,000 tons, the Tripoli is not merely a ship. It is a mobile staging base projecting power across the horizon. On its flight deck, the rotors of 2 MH-60 Seahawk helicopters were already turning. Aboard those Seahawks were the Marines of the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit. Upon receiving the confirmation of disabling fire, the helicopters banked hard toward the coordinates, covering the distance in under 3 minutes. They approached from the stern, utilizing the cargo ship's massive superstructure to mask their vector from potential small arms fire. Hovering 40 feet above the pitching deck in the dead of night, the insertion began. A combat boarding is not a negotiation. It is an overwhelming saturation of localized force. Carrying 60 pounds of tactical equipment, operators utilized fast ropes to descend. It is a controlled fall dictated purely by grip strength and gravity, taking roughly 3 seconds from the helicopter cabin to the steel deck below. Within 30 seconds, 12 elite United States Marines had established a perimeter on the MV Tusca. They moved with violent, practiced precision. Teams fractured to secure the bridge, push aft toward the crew quarters, and clear the smoking, shattered ruins of the engine room. From the moment the first Marine boots hit the deck to the transmission, declaring the massive vessel fully secure, less than 10 minutes had elapsed. The Iranian provocation, a floating fortress designed to test the psychological limits of the American empire, had been structurally dismantled, seized, and brought firmly under United States custody. But while the tactical execution was flawless, the strategic trap was only just springing shut. To understand the true weight of the MV Tusca seizure, you have to look backward. This was not a spontaneous eruption of violence. It was the activation of a deeply ingrained historical muscle memory. The parallels to the late 20th century are impossible to ignore. In 1988, during Operations Earnest Will and Praying Mantis, the United States Navy was tasked with an almost identical strategic mandate. Iranian forces were mining the Persian Gulf, harassing international shipping, and threatening to strangle the global economic artery of the Strait of Hormuz. On April 18th of that year, after the guided missile frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts struck an Iranian mine and narrowly avoided sinking, the Reagan administration authorized a devastating kinetic response. Operation Praying Mantis was unleashed. In just 8 hours, American naval forces systematically sank or disabled roughly half of Iran's combat-capable fleet. Offshore platforms were reduced to burning husks, frigates were sent to the bottom of the Gulf, and fast attack boats were utterly obliterated. The message written in fire and seawater was absolute. The United States Navy does not tolerate threats to freedom of navigation. Nearly 4 decades later, the operational philosophy remains identical. The sequence of engagement, methodical warnings, strict lawful procedures, undeniable documentation, followed by immediate and overwhelming force, has not changed. The very same 5-inch weapon system that tore through the Tusca's engine room is the direct lineage of the guns that shattered Iranian platforms in 1988. The Marines sliding down fast ropes into the darkness were executing insertion techniques refined over generations of maritime interdiction operations. The tactical playbook works, so it has not been altered. But while the tactics rhyme with history, the strategic reality has violently shifted. In 1988, America was engaged in a traditional naval shootout against state-operated combat vessels. The objective was terminal destruction. In 2026, the United States Navy is forced to fight a shadow war against weaponized logistics. The MV Tusca was not a military target. It was a civilian behemoth. Sinking a 275-meter cargo ship in international waters was politically and environmentally impossible. The United States was forced to evolve from outright annihilation to strategic paralysis. They could not sink the ship. They had to capture it. This shift represents a terrifying new paradigm in geopolitical conflict. By using massive, sanctioned commercial vessels as pawns, Iran is fundamentally altering the rules of the game. They are forcing the world's most advanced military to act as a heavily armed maritime police force. The United States successfully disabled and detained the Tusca, proving they still possess the lethal capacity to control the surface of the sea. But executing a flawless boarding operation is only half the equation. The other half is what happens on land, where the diplomatic fallout from these 5-inch shells was about to trigger an entirely new kind of explosion. The geopolitical shockwave of a 5-inch naval shell travels much faster than the speed of sound. While the Marine boarding teams were still securing the shattered deck of the MV Tusca, the diplomatic architecture of the entire Middle East was already disintegrating. The kinetic seizure occurred on April 19th. The very next day, Vice President J.D. Vance was scheduled to land in Islamabad, Pakistan, for a highly anticipated second round of peace talks with Iranian negotiators. Those talks never materialized. Tehran abruptly grounded its delegation, issuing a stark public mandate that no diplomatic engagement would occur while the American naval blockade remained in place. The fragile ceasefire, which had been holding by a thread, evaporated 2 days later. The Persian Gulf was instantly plunged back into a hyper-volatile equilibrium of threat and response. It was a brutal demonstration of how localized tactical violence dictates the ceiling of global strategic reality. The American naval operation had not just disabled a cargo ship, it had decisively detonated the diplomatic off-ramp. In a desperate bid to project strength and save face domestically, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps immediately lashed out. But they did not target the USS Spruance. They did not attempt to engage the American blockade directly. Instead, on the exact same day the Tusca was seized, Iranian forces opened fire on 3 defenseless commercial vessels attempting to transit the Strait of Hormuz, 1 French, 1 British, and 1 Greek. It was the geopolitical equivalent of a violent temper tantrum. Iran was punishing soft targets precisely because the hard target in the Arabian Sea had just demonstrated the terminal cost of direct confrontation. They could not touch the United States Navy, so they bled the international supply chain instead. But Washington had anticipated this asymmetric retaliation, and they were already expanding the battle space far beyond the Middle East. The true, terrifying scale of the American containment strategy was revealed just 48 hours after the Tusca was boarded. Half a world away in the waters of the Bay of Bengal, the Pentagon announced that U.S. forces had successfully intercepted and detained another sanctioned tanker, the MT Tiffany. The Pentagon's subsequent statement was chillingly bureaucratic, noting they would pursue global maritime enforcement to disrupt illicit networks anywhere they operate. Read that carefully. Not just the Persian Gulf. Anywhere. The blockade was not a regional chokehold. It was a planetary dragnet. The United States was demonstrating a level of sustained, global operational reach that no other military on Earth can mimic. To track, intercept, and secure multiple massive vessels across different oceans simultaneously requires an intelligence apparatus and a logistical tale that is almost incomprehensible in its scale. Washington was sending a clear message to Beijing, Moscow, and every other capital watching this crisis unfold. The United States Navy possesses the unyielding reach to suffocate an adversary's economy anywhere on the map. But this staggering projection of power obscures a much darker, underlying reality. The United States might be dominating the surface of the water, but they are willingly sailing into a war of attrition where the mathematical odds are deeply, structurally rigged against them. But in the realm of cold realism, you must look beyond the tactical win and examine the asymmetric ledger. Yes, the United States executed a flawless kinetic operation. But look at the math required to achieve it. Washington deployed a $1 billion Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, fired multiple precision 5-inch naval shells, launched 2 MH-60 Seahawk helicopters, and risked the lives of 12 elite Marines from the 31st MEU, all to stop a rusting sanctioned cargo ship. Iran is not attempting to defeat the United States Navy in a direct kinetic engagement. They know that is impossible. Their strategy is entirely economic. By throwing expendable, massive civilian logistics vessels into the blockade perimeter, Tehran is forcing the United States to expend highly sophisticated, incredibly expensive military assets just to maintain the status quo. Sinking the vessels is politically impossible. Ignoring them breaks the blockade. Therefore, the U.S. is forced to capture them. The United States Navy is currently playing the role of a heavily armed, multi-billion-dollar global traffic cop. And while America's resources are vast, they are not infinite. Every warship tied down policing commercial lanes in the Arabian Sea or the Bay of Bengal is a warship that is not patrolling the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, or the North Atlantic. This is the hidden genius of the Iranian trap. They are using the sheer mass of global commerce to bleed American naval readiness dry, one cargo ship at a time. The United States won the battle for the MV Tusca, but they are fighting an adversary perfectly willing to lose cheap ships in order to exhaust expensive missiles. When a superpower is forced to use a sledgehammer to kill a mosquito, the question isn't whether the mosquito dies. It's how long the superpower can keep swinging before its arm gives out. So, I leave you with this strategic question to debate in the comments. In an era of asymmetric warfare, where cheap drones and expendable civilian ships can paralyze global logistics, is the overwhelming, high-tech firepower of the United States Navy actually its greatest strategic vulnerability? Let me know your geopolitical analysis below, and we will dissect it in the next brief.